Well, welcome. Tonight we have one of the hardworking people up on Beacon Hill, somebody who's fighting for us all the time. Senator, why don't we start with an introduction if there's somebody out there who doesn't know you by now?
Well, thanks, Al. I appreciate us being together, though apart. I'm Ryan Fattman. I have the privilege and honor of serving as the state senator for the Worcester-Norfolk district, which of course includes the center of the universe, the town of Milford. And it's been my occasion to come on time and time again, maybe quarterly, to provide some updates about what's going on in our Commonwealth and up on Beacon Hill. And I'm really happy to do that tonight.
Well, before we go through what you're doing to help Milford, let's hit some basic topics. Mail-in voting. I see you've been busy on that.
Yeah, I think in the pandemic experience that a lot of people have gone through, over the last year, mail-in voting has become a really important topic. I serve on the elections committee, as I have for the last 6 years that I've served in the Massachusetts State Senate. And this was an idea that when the pandemic came around, I actually was one of the proponents of, because I wanted to make sure people could vote in a safe and secure way, that their health, especially for those who are older and might be having underlying health conditions, was preserved, and that we preserved, our institutions of democracy and representative government on both the state and local level. And, I think we've learned some lessons along the way. First, we allowed for towns to be able to move their election dates and gave flexibility there back in, March of 2020. And then in November and September, we experimented with our first ever no excuse mail-in ballot, which I think was really an important experience. Back in December, after the election was over, myself and several other members of the election committee sent a letter to Secretary of State Bill Galvin, basically asking for a strategic analysis of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats to our mail-in voting system, so that as we think about maybe expanding or retracting or enhancing the mail-in voting, that we have all the answers. And obviously the Secretary of State runs our elections through the local municipalities. And unfortunately, he didn't get back to us. We had to write him again in March. And at which point he had said, well, it's basically impossible for us to answer a lot of your questions. I always think it's very concerning when an elected official who at any capacity says it's impossible to answer questions about public policy. And so some of the questions we asked were fairly straightforward. One of the lessons we learned from the mail-in balloting system that I don't think anyone really expected was security of ballot boxes and drop boxes. In Boston, sometime in September, there was an attack on one of those ballot boxes where somebody, did one of the worst things you probably could do in our system. They lit the ballot box on fire. And, during the testimony that happened in May 2020, that was never addressed in the elections committee. No one ever brought that up as a potential threat. We now know it to be true. And when you consider the fact that there's been a lot of claims about, electioneering and interference by foreign governments, both in 2016 and then in 2020, you kind of wonder, hey, if you can mess with elections on the web, what stops somebody from attacking a ballot box if you make this permanent? And how do we secure those systems? So that was one of the questions that we asked the Secretary of State about. And we also asked, the important questions about enfranchising voters. So, we all have the right to vote. That's a good thing. The more people voting, the better our democracy hopefully is. But what we found is, absentee ballots oftentimes have the highest rejection rate of all balloting and voting. And so in the September primary, we know for a fact that 18,000 people who tried to vote had their ballots thrown out. We wanted to know why. Why were those ballots disqualified? And if you can't answer that question, that's a very, sincere concern. No one should be disenfranchised for whatever reason, legal reason. We want to make sure people's right to vote is protected. And if you extend that over to the general election, if 18,000 voters had their ballots thrown out, and we don't know the reason why, today we still don't know how many general election ballots were thrown out. The second time we sent along our inquiry to the Secretary of State's office, we actually got a phone call from a member of the staff of the Secretary of State. And they said, I know for a fact that they can answer some of these questions. You should go down to the Commonwealth's archives, which is over near UMass Boston, and go to room 149. And I think you'll find some of the answers to the questions that you're looking for. And I'm like, this sounds like, a phone call whistleblower out of the Raiders of the Lost Ark with the big warehouse at the end of the movie. And so I actually showed up with a few of my colleagues and went down there and tried to get access to room 149. And we were told we weren't able to access it because it wasn't available to the public, and we needed to do a records request. But they did admit that there were multi-thousand absentee ballot applications that were rejected and sent back. The person on the phone who called me, who I don't know who it was, they wouldn't identify themselves, said it was as many as 500,000. So, if that's the case, if it is 500,000, why aren't they getting delivered? Why potentially are these people even on the voting rolls? Potentially they've already moved out of state. Why is it that there's such a high rate when we only have, approximately 4.5 million voters registered to vote here in Massachusetts? How do you have 500,000 potentially rejected? And that furthers the question about enfranchisement and disenfranchisement. Are we not able to get ballots to people and then they're not able to vote? Like, was that a trend? So these are really serious concerns. And on the elections committee, I've got a lot of responsibility with trying to get the answers to the questions. And that's something I've been working on pretty hard since December, and using my platform as being on the elections committee, having voted in favor of this program before, wanting to make sure that it's a secure program, that it's perfected, and that we have all the answers before we say, hey, let's do this forever. Perhaps we shouldn't do it forever. We just got to get the answers to those questions.
Now, Ryan, first of all, what's a no excuse ballot?
So that's a great question. Thank you, Al. Some of this is a lot of jargon. So we've always had in Massachusetts absentee ballots,
right,
mail-in ballots. Anybody can request them. And there's provisions for that, though. One, you physically are unable to get to the ballot box, and therefore you need to vote absentee. And that could be because of a physical disability or ailment, or that you're out of state. Could be that you're traveling. It could be military service. And then obviously we extended early voting for the last election cycles to allow for people to have more time to vote, which has proven to be very popular. And those two things have existed now in this past current election. But back in May, June, July, what the legislature debated was changing the absentee program, where you either had to be out of state or you had to be sick and not physically able to show up to your ballot box, to say, if you want a ballot because of the pandemic and you don't feel comfortable going to your ballot on election day, your ballot box on election day, you have the right to request a ballot in advance of both the primary and the general election, and you can mail in your ballot. And that's why it's called no excuse absentee ballot or mail-in balloting, because you don't need a legal excuse for why you're sending that in via mail, where in our old system you did in Massachusetts and in most states.
That's interesting, because we've been voting by mail for a long time.
Yes, correct.
I worked up in Salem, New Hampshire, so it was a 2-hour ride. So if I wait for the precincts to open, I got to work halfway through the day. It was the middle of the morning. So I requested an absentee ballot, and I've just been using it ever since. It's wonderful.
Yep.
But I never knew there was strict rules as to when you can use it. And so what's the difference between early voting and absentee voting?
So early voting allows for the ballot boxes to be open early, at the town hall or a designated voting area. And we did it, for both the primary and the general election. And essentially it's, we actually extended it so that there was a longer time period to vote than previous campaign cycles. And I believe it was 2 weeks, and in most places it has to have at least one day where it is a weekend day. And so I think those are generally good public policy practices when it comes to elections. I have a few concerns about them. One, not every town is created equal, or city, right? So the city of Boston and the resources that Boston has in executing this is very different than the town I represent in Millville, which has 3,000-ish residents and, one town clerk, and she's responsible for all of the electioneering that happens in town. So we want to make sure that towns are equipped to handle flow and capacity. Number two, one of the things I point out, and which is why I don't vote early, I like to vote on election day. I'm kind of a game day kind of guy, is because in the last presidential election, if you recall, Pete Buttigieg, who ran for president of the United States in the Democratic primary, 3 days before he was going to be on the ballot in Massachusetts, which had, about 10 days early voting leading up to the point, he dropped out of the race. And so if you voted for Pete Buttigieg for president of the United States, you could argue legitimately you threw away your vote because he dropped out himself. And there's no way to recall that vote back in the new system that we had. In the old system, actually, if you voted absentee and you voted early, you could actually recall that ballot back. But the new law changed it, and you can't do that anymore, which was one of the concerns I had, because you would imagine if somebody dropped out of a race in the very last second and you no longer could legitimately vote for that person, you probably would want to change your vote. Or if potentially you learned something new, about a candidate or an issue, you may be inclined to change your vote. So that's one of the reasons why I've always been cautious about early voting, though I think if people want to exercise that, that's their prerogative, and I have no problem with that being legal. And the last thing I would say when it comes to, the mail-in balloting, we just want to make sure we get it right. We want to make sure we're not sending multiple ballots to people. We want to make sure that it's efficient and taxpayer friendly and town friendly. The towns are supposed to be reimbursed for a lot of the costs. And, if they're not, and that's part of the law, that's a real unfunded mandate and very concerning, especially when you're in a pandemic. And I guess the last thing I would say is, and this was something that's really weighed on my mind and something that I really have to think about as we talk about these policies, is Tufts University's Public Policy Institute testified in May of 2020 when the election committee had the original hearing on mail-in balloting, universal, essentially mail-in balloting through an absentee process. And, one of the gentlemen from their Public Policy Institute said that they're not concerned about fraud, that they're concerned about the perception of fraud. And for the perception of fraud to essentially corrode the institution of our democracy. And I think if you watch what's played out across the country over the election cycle for president, there's a lot of validity to that concern. I don't think it's to say there's validity to, whether the question was fraudulent or not. I think it's the institution of our democracy, protecting it and making sure that people believe the process is legitimate. That's never really been questioned significantly in our history as a nation. Perhaps on a handful of occasions, 2000 would be a good example with the presidential election of Bush v. Gore. But before that, you have to go back almost 100 years. And, because of politics these days, probably people feel strongly that there's questions about the 2016 election and the 2020 election, which perhaps is the cast of characters who are running and the claims that they make as well. So we've got a responsibility to be mature about this subject because the foundation of our country relies upon it. Trust is, the currency of our country in many ways when it comes to elected office and in our election systems.
Now, if I vote by the mail and then I show up at the polling location, how do they know I already voted?
It's a great question. The way it's supposed to work is when you send your mail-in ballot, the town clerk or the city clerk, the election commission, they are allowed to process said ballots prior to the election. They are not allowed to run those and actually count the votes they are allowed to open the ballot. So there's two envelopes that a ballot comes in. The outside envelope initially, and then the ballot envelope. And part of that is designed to protect the ballot, inclement weather, type stuff, but also to protect the person's vote and sort of the confidence of the system. And so in this election cycle, a few days before the election, people were allowed to open those ballots up. And the reason why they did that is you could then check off the person's name of whether they voted or not on the rolls. And when somebody showed up, just like you would in any election, you check in and your name would already be checked off saying that you voted. So that was sort of the safeguard. One of the things that I advocated for, and I'm going to continue to advocate for, goes back to the legitimacy of our elections and making sure people believe that the results are real and that their leaders are duly and legitimately elected. And I had put forward an amendment to this bill that would allow for the election commissioners. Each town and city has election commissioners. The way it's supposed to work is there's supposed to be an equal amount of Democrats and Republicans that serve in this capacity. And they oversee the elections. They sit there during election day. They watch the ballot boxes. Sometimes they even participate in checking people in and out. I wanted them to be able to be notified by the town clerks or by any election official when these ballots were processed early, the location, the time, and that they would have the right to show up and visit and oversee. Unfortunately, that didn't make it into the law. That is something, like I said, I think would be a good government practice. Make sure that we keep our elections safe and that we have a process that people trust. And I think that that's one of the ways, you do it in a bipartisan way.
Now, on the envelope, there seemed to be a little R or a little D. Do you know what that's about?
I don't. And I can't really speak to that. I've heard. I
was just curious.
Yeah, I think it's the past election is a really tough conversation for anybody to have because people have a lot of opinions about it. And that exists in my family as well, some of which I don't necessarily agree with. And, so I think we got to be sensitive to how everybody feels about this, because the second we start deriding people, I think creates a real problem for our community. People need to be heard. I don't think that there was any marks that, were made on the outside of these ballots about indicating who was who and whatnot. That should never happen. And it hopefully didn't happen. If it did happen, obviously we need to look into it. And that's why I stress the importance of doing our due diligence to understand how the system worked, what the successes were, what the weaknesses were, and how we improve upon it, or having a legitimate discussion whether we should move forward with it or just revert back to the old ways. I think there's an important conversation to have about, access to voting, and, early voting gives more access. Absentee ballot, the way it used to be done, gives more access. But hopefully, as this pandemic dies down and goes away and we solve it, we can go back to normal. And I think the normal system we had was pretty good. And I think that, we need to continue to make sure we improve our election systems.
Now, you mentioned that people had feelings. I had very strong feelings over this last election because we had 12% in Milford. 12% of the people turned out, which to me, it was so disappointing because, it is the one time during the year when I get to express my opinion and somebody has to listen. But isn't it good to get easier ways to vote and get more people out to vote?
Yeah, I think there's pros and cons, and like everything in life, there's a balance. I love eating cake. My last name's Fattman. I got to be careful of these things. And there's health considerations and all that stuff. So there's pros to absentee ballots. There's pros to more availability. And there's legitimate conversations and policy debates to be had about both sides. And I think the security issue has always been something that I have been concerned about. And I think it's a legitimate point to say, I have to prove who I am in almost every instance of life when I go to purchase something or, do something of significance. And a lot of times, people criticize our election system that you don't have to do that. Of course, when you go to vote, of course, if you fraudulently vote, there's severe consequences for that. So we have laws to try to dissuade people from doing that. But in general, yes, I think it is a good idea to make voting accessible. But you have to, like I said before, early voting is one of the ways to do that. But if you vote early and then something significant happens within the last 5 or 6 months of the election, and that influences what you might do, including someone dropping out, in a multi-candidate race, like happened in the presidential primary for the Democratic side, you potentially are disenfranchising people, and that's not good for anybody. So there's pros and cons, and that's the conversation we're going to be having probably for the next few months on the Elections Committee on how we sort through it.
Now, I'm a little confused. I still don't understand what the big issue is with showing an ID to prove it's me.
Yeah.
So I can't get into an airplane. I can't get into a lot of buildings without an ID.
Yep.
So what's the big deal?
So in full disclosure, I would be a supporter of somebody who's, vote with an ID. I think that that's a legitimate process. It's not about disenfranchising anybody. I've already said multiple times here, I want to enfranchise as many people as possible, and I want voter participation. I think what it comes down to is the point that I made earlier that this guy from Tufts University made is you got to make sure that elections are viewed as legitimate, not, kangaroo courts where you see what happens in sort of other countries where democracies get destabilized. There's no one who believes that Vladimir Putin is getting 78% of the vote without any sort of real scary tactics and pressure. Opposition parties are made to be opposition parties without, violence and whatnot. And you want to make sure that, people are safe and secure in how they vote and what they think. And I think, one of the ways that people criticize voting with ID, and I think it's a valid criticism, is, you might exclude people. So the way that you would solve that problem is if someone doesn't have an ID, you make them publicly available, so that the government actually provides you one. I've heard a proposal that everybody who's a registered voter would be entitled to a voter ID card.
For free.
For free. Yep. And the point is, if you add a cost, and this is the criticism, and it's a legitimate criticism, if you add a cost, say $10, someone might not be able to afford that cost, and then therefore they couldn't vote. And that would not be fair and not constitutional. Someone may say, who's listening, why couldn't someone afford $10 on the most important part of their life? Well, first of all, you assume that that's the most important part of their life. And second, if we're going to make this system work and make it available to everybody, we need to do that. And I think that that is a good public policy to have. Now, you vote and you register just like you would to get your license. And a few days later, an ID shows up and it shows who you are and where you're registered to vote. And that's the way it works. I have my license to carry. The law says I have to carry that at all times. And, when I'm exercising a constitutional right to carry. And if I switch towns, I have to call that town and notify the town I've now moved in. And, the same thing could be true of a voter ID card. It is a, somewhat of a controversial topic these days because of the way it gets portrayed. But I think the vast majority of people, most public polls show like 75% of the people think it's a good idea and support it. And I do too.
Well, moving on, we always hit the fun part of finances. How's it looking this year?
This is, it's a really important topic. I serve on the Ways and Means Committee for the Massachusetts Senate. I've been on there for the last 4 years. I've tried to leverage that to help the town of Milford and other towns that I represent to try to get access to money for important projects that, the town cares about. Downtown revitalization, Godfrey Brook, opioid and addiction issues through Amy Leone, who's,
Ryan, we've been very happy with the amount of money you and working with Brian have brought to Milford. So thank you.
And Brian and I, Representative Murray and I, and before him, Representative Fernandez, we're happy to, work together and try to make something happen. Milford Youth Center, we've been able to secure money for. And, I was really concerned about this budget cycle because of the economic impacts of COVID. And I think a lot of people are still. I think, we're not through this. There's a lot of businesses out there struggling still, especially in certain sectors like the restaurant industry. And, obviously when businesses struggle, the state budget, which is based on tax revenue, struggles as well. The good news is economic activity in most sectors is flying off the rails and is exploding. It's very good in Massachusetts. And you can see that through various indications. We have been over benchmark for our revenue projections. So, we're actually, I believe, $1.2 billion right now over benchmark, which is about 6% more than what we thought we were going to take in, which is fantastic news. And it shows that, the economy is rebounding. There was a severe concern about what the chart would look like, in a recovery. You hope for a V, right? A V recovery where things go down and then they pop right back up. Right. There's a lot of talk about sort of a slow decline and then this flattening out of, an economic recovery. It does seem like we've kind of gone back up in the right direction. I'm trying to get the hand signals right here on Zoom, and I'm not sure I am, but, so we're above benchmark. The federal government has stepped in a very big way. That's going to help significantly. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts is getting $8.5 billion to assist both local and state governments, here in the Commonwealth, $4 billion of which is dedicated to education alone, and is done through the Title I formula, which means that Milford, which has some kids that, are unfortunately economically not well off, will benefit, and the town of Milford will get more money. And that's, a good for Milford and good for the community. It's also important to know that in Massachusetts, since this crisis happened, there has been $78 billion that has come through our state from the federal government. I think there's two ways to look at that. One, a lot of it was in business assistance, like PPP programs, Paycheck Protection Act. We just did something of significance there. The Paycheck Protection Act was designed to help small businesses and businesses in general keep their employees employed, not lay them off and send them into unemployment, and then create a problem on the back end with unemployment insurance and, increase government assistance. For a lot of people, it worked really well. And that was, if you successfully completed that program where you kept your employment roles stable from the time the crisis started to the time it ended, that money would actually be forgiven. And so if you got $1 million loan to keep your employees employed, and you had, let's just say 10 employees, and, a year and a half later, you've got 10 employees or 11, that $1 million gets
forgiven.
Thank you. And then in addition to that, it's tax-free. It's not considered income. We ran into a problem in Massachusetts where small businesses set up as S corporations and LLCs were actually being taxed. And, essentially, we were able to waive that. It's a bill that I helped co-sponsor. And we basically were able to forgive these small businesses if they lived up to their end of the bargain. And the way the feds designed it, then there shouldn't be taxes on the Massachusetts side. And I think that's a good policy for everybody. And the last thing I'll say is, obviously a lot of money's gone into public health and making sure that people are safe, secure, and obviously through personal protection equipment. A lot of that in the beginning played out in a way that was not good. We found out all of our vulnerabilities in a pandemic crisis, lack of PPE, lack of hand sanitizer, all those things, which I decided to get involved in fairly publicly to help out Milford Hospital and make sure they had the supplies they needed to protect their nurses and their doctors and their personnel. A lot of those situations due to supply chain have been corrected, and there's been federal assistance for all those things. My only real concern about all of this is we spent about $5.5 trillion in this crisis. And, I do get concerned about inflation. In future generations, we're now $30 trillion in debt as a nation. And while that might not affect you and me, Al, so much, I do get concerned about my children and your grandchildren and how that plays out long term. And I think it's just something we have to be cognizant of. Money doesn't grow on trees. It is a real monetary concept, and we just have to be very careful about that.
Well, I mean, the whole concept of free money.
Yeah.
Somebody's going to have to pay for the free money.
Right.
You
Yep.
know?
Absolutely.
Now, when you mentioned we're doing better than our projected baseline, was that a real baseline or was it amped down because of the pandemic?
No, so that's a great question. So most people thought, so we let's go back a little bit here. The budget for FY21, usually fiscal year 21, usually starts in July and it ends at the end of June. So that's our fiscal year as a Commonwealth. And every single town in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, all 351 cities and towns follow that. And one of the most unique things that's happened in our history is in this year of 2020 with the pandemic, we actually didn't have a fiscal year 2021 budget until late December. No one put a budget together because no one had an idea how this pandemic was actually impacting the various accounts that we fund. And so they thought as time went on, we'd have more information, more insight into what the federal government was going to do to help, and then that we could leverage those things and do it later. We are now in budget FY22. And essentially what happened in December of 2020 to create the FY21 budget was they did the projections and they started of revenue and spending, and they started finding that not much was going to change, relatively speaking. The budget was still increasing, revenues were still increasing, and a lot of people attributed that to sort of the fiscal stimulus that happened in the CARES Act, under the previous presidential administration and Congress. And, I think that as we move forward and society opens up, as you probably are aware, the governor is, moving us forward into the final stages of reopening. More economic activity is going to lead to more revenue, and that's going to help with the budget situation. And it is all above what was, the original benchmark that was concluded in December 2020.
Now, today, my home is celebrating being fully vaccinated. My youngest went, signed up, got called, went there today and got her vaccination.
Yep.
If I asked you to paint us a picture of the pandemic in Massachusetts, and I know I'm being very self-focused on our state, but tell me how you feel about Massachusetts and handling the pandemic.
So I think the greatest lesson for me in the pandemic was to concentrate on what you could fix as an individual in your job responsibilities and how you handle, taking on problems. Because obviously this was crisis management. And I would say, in March and April, my phone really didn't stop ringing. Superintendents wanted to know, should they cancel school? Should they do remote learning? Did they have the ability to do that via education laws, public health officials reaching out, so on and so forth. So I learned some of those lessons. And as I saw the vaccination plan roll out, one of the things I came to realize very quickly is that in our area, the Blackstone Valley area extended, southern Worcester County, there was sort of a desert of vaccine availability. And I started lobbying very hard through Karen Polito, our lieutenant governor, and also Governor Baker, that southern Worcester County needed a regional vaccination site. And back in March, we were able to successfully achieve that. Uxbridge's McCloskey School, which was their old middle school, and built as a memorial, the gym, to World War II and those who paid the ultimate sacrifice, opened up on March 22nd as a vaccine site with 750 vaccinations a day, and has consistently hit those numbers for people. It's not just people in our area, but it is statewide. But one of the negotiating points that we had is that 25% of all the vaccines daily were reserved for people in the 13 communities that it really was meant to serve in this regional collaborative, including Milford. And that was really important, because when constituents call our office and they say, I can't get through on the website, which was a disaster, and in some cases still is, you know, I wanted to be able to call Jackie over at the Board of Health, or Cheryl over in Sutton, or, you know, all these people who have done God's work over the course of the last year, and say, hey, you know, this guy, Joe Schmo, is 77 years old. He's not really familiar with, you know, how to operate a computer and sign up on the website. Do you think we can get him in to help him? And, you know, 99% of the time, the answer has been yes. And within like 72 hours, we get people who haven't been able to get vaccinated, which is fantastic. And that I knew I could utilize my relationship with our local legislative delegation, with the Baker administration and Karen Polito from Central Mass, and get them down into Southern Worcester County and make that successful. And we've done that. I think there's fair criticism that, you know, the beginning of the vaccine rollout was tragic. I'd also balance that with, this has never been done before. We are literally building an airplane and learning how to fly it as it's taking off. And so not that I would say that we should accept failure, because I don't think we should. I think we learn from the failures and we move on. And that's a really important thing. I think one of the blessings we have to consider in all of this is that we had a vaccine in a very short period of time that was developed with lightning speed, with lots of stakeholders involved. And we live in the greatest country in the world that will, by the end of this, by this time next year, every single person will be vaccinated who wants to be and should be. And that's unbelievable. And that's probably going to happen even before this time next year. It's probably going to happen by July 4th.
And Ryan, I was one of the people who, when President Trump said he would have a vaccine by the end of the year last year, I didn't believe him. I've been working with too many vaccine companies and too many pharmaceutical companies. I said, this is going to be 2 to 3 years to come out with a legitimate vaccine. My hat is tipped. I don't know what they did. I don't know how they did it, except throw $1 billion at it. But anybody who complains about $1 billion isn't looking at how many people were saved, because normally vaccines are years in the making, never mind in the acceptance process.
I mean, if you look at polio, for example, and the decades that it took to develop a vaccine for polio, a very deadly disease, you have to really reflect upon and marvel how society has progressed. It's truly incredible. I mean, we are very blessed. You know, we talk about mail-in voting, we talk about budgets, we talk about vaccinations, and like, these are conversations that happen in the United States because we're just blessed. I mean, we live in a great nation, and we have resources and smart people, and just, it's incredible. And I remember reading an article. It was basically in the Wall Street Journal, and it was essentially the Second Manhattan Project about developing a vaccine and the private money that went into it, trillions of dollars. You know, that is the difference. You know, it usually, you know, vaccine investments take years for both approval and billions upon billions of dollars of investment, and a lot of times a lot of failure. You know, I believe I read $2.5 trillion in private money to come together philanthropically and develop this vaccine so that people's lives would get back to normal and not destroyed. And like, you know, this pandemic has been difficult on everybody. I don't care where you're from, what you do, who you are. You know, it might have been that you had to work at home, and maybe that you don't have children, maybe, you know, you don't have a lot of responsibilities other than to work, and you got to keep your job, but then you were socially isolated, and maybe you decided to cope by drinking more, or you couldn't see your family. That's tough stuff. Just as it's tough for a mom who, maybe 2 or 3 days a week had her kids go, or a dad, to daycare that got shut down and could no longer do that. Or, if you're a doctor or a nurse that is on the front lines of this thing, or police officer, firefighter, EMT, afraid to get sick and yet feeling in your heart you got to do your job. I mean, this has just been a terrible year, past year and a half, and my hat goes off to a lot of people for just sticking through it. I get the frustration, but God bless everybody who has done their best to keep a positive, optimistic outlook, because it's not been easy to do so.
Well, I also want to keep in mind that I promised Miss Stephanie we would let you be with the family tonight, since we had you all night last night in Milford, and now we're taking up a chunk of your night. One last question.
Sure.
Are you getting flooded with opinions and calls about getting kids back in school?
Early on, we did, and this is where I say this is one of those frustrations, again, that everybody has, especially if you have children. I think, there's a lot of people who have to go to work, and the way that's augmented is by their kids going to public schools. And, a lot of companies have reopened, and our Commonwealth's economy is reopening quickly, and they've got to put food on the table and pay their mortgage. And, a lot of the laws that were put in place to help people are in some cases expiring, where, people had the ability to delay their rent payments, and that's ending. So, we did get a lot, on both sides, parents and concerned citizens, but also teachers. And, I think if you're an older individual as a teacher, but didn't qualify for sort of phase one, and we're concerned about your health, and maybe you have diabetes and you're 60 years old as opposed to 65, I can see someone having a legitimate concern about going back. But I think what we had to do as a government is ensure that we send teachers back in the safest manner possible, with kids being safe as well, and making sure society starts reopening. We can't do this forever. And there's economic issues, psychological issues that people have had to deal with, that until we get back to normal, it can't be corrected. And taking steps to go towards normalcy is something I support full-heartedly.
Well, it is the time when I promised that you would have some time for your family. So any last words, Senator?
I'm just grateful to be on, Al. It's always good to see you. I'm looking forward to when we can do this in person, in that wonderful Milford TV studio. And, it's wonderful to be getting back out in the community, going to events and, honoring people for their service in Milford and all across the district. And I'm looking forward to doing that throughout the summer and seeing people that I represent, and hopefully they'll say hello.
Well, starting next month, it looks like all of our crew will be double vaccinated plus 2 weeks, so we can move back into the studio. We'll still have to be careful.
Sure.
But it sure feels good to see us coming to the end of, or at least a stable side of this pandemic.
Absolutely.
And we thank you for everything you bring. Good night. May God bless everybody that's watching, our 6 loyal viewers, and your wonderful family. Good night, Ryan.
Thank you very much.
Not too long since I've been home, been running all my life just searching for my soul.